I'm Rachel Bronson. I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2019 Doomsday Clock setting, as well as the release of the 2019 clock statement, which can be found on the tables outside and soon to be posted on our website at thebulletin.org. The Doomsday Clock is now in its 72nd year and represents the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board's answer to two important questions. The first, is the future of civilization safer or at greater risk than it was last year? And second, is the future of civilization safer or at greater risk today compared to the more than 7 decades that we've been asking the question? There are many topics we consider when answering these questions. For most of our history, we focused exclusively on the risk of nuclear weapons in setting the time of the clock. Starting in 2007, climate change began factoring more prominently as a direct challenge, a man-made challenge that will dramatically affect life on Earth as we know it and requires urgent and immediate action. The Bulletin has been covering issues of climate for decades, but in 2007, it was formally recognized as an existential risk in our clock setting. Today, in addition to nuclear risk and climate, technological innovations are considered as they're occurring in the realms of cyber, biology, artificial intelligence at a speed that challenges society's ability to keep pace. At the Bulletin, we continue to believe that advances in science and technology should make life on Earth better, not worse. To that end, our goal is to equip the public, policymakers, and scientists with the information needed to demand, recognize, and support public policies that reduce man-made existential threats such as nuclear war, climate change, and those from disruptive technologies. Before moving on to this year's clock setting, I'd like to introduce my colleagues in the front row who you'll be hearing from shortly, who will approach the clock in a few minutes, and who are representing the authors of the report that explain the time. After setting the time, they will come up to the dais and offer short remarks about why the time is set where it is, and they'll take your questions. Speaking today are Jerry Brown, the Executive Chair of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the former 4-term governor of the state of California. Jerry Brown is a recognized leader in identifying climate change as an existential challenge and in building a political response to it. He also maintains a long-standing record of trying to reduce the threat of nuclear war. William J. Perry, the author of My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, was the 19th U.S. Secretary of Defense and is the chair of the Bulletin's Board of Sponsors, a group that includes 14 Nobel Prize winners from across the globe. Dr. Perry is currently the Michael and Barbara Berberian Professor Emeritus at Stanford University and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1997, among other distinguished awards. Robert Rosner is the chair of the Bulletin Science and Security Board. Bob is the William E. Rather Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. He served as the director of Argonne National Lab, where he has also served as chief scientist. Sharon Squassoni, a member of our Science and Security Board, is a research professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Sharon has specialized in nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and security policy for 3 decades. Susan Solomon is a member of our Science and Security Board. She is the Lee and Geraldine Martin Professor of Environmental Studies at MIT. She received the Crawford Prize in Geosciences from the Swedish Academy of Sciences in 2018, akin to the Nobel Prize. And Herb Lynn is a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and the Hank J. Holland Fellow in Cyber Policy and Security at the Hoover Institution, both at Stanford University. His work focuses on offensive operations in cyberspace and its use as an instrument of national policy. More about each can be found on our website at thebulletin.org. In 2017, we moved the clock from 3 to 2.5 minutes to midnight to describe a darkening global security landscape, as well as new and troubling trends in increasing recklessness around diplomatic language and attack on experts and expertise at a time when scientific advancement requires funding, attention, and respect. In 2018, we moved the clock from 2.5 to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest it had been to midnight in the history of the clock, sharing the time with 1953, when both the US and the Soviets had exploded hydrogen bombs, tested hydrogen bombs. We pointed to a collapsing arms control architecture, as well as new testing undertaken by North Korea, nuclear exercises built into Russian military plans, and continued commitment to nuclear weapons in Pakistan, India, and China. In 2019, we considered all of these factors. We recognized that rhetoric between the United States and North Korea has eased, although the situation remains extremely dangerous, as is made obvious from the US Secretary of Defense's 2019 Missile Defense Review, and that relations between US and Russia remain unacceptably strained. Earlier factors that comprise the current time are nothing less than a perfect storm that increase the likelihood of nuclear conflict through blunder and accident. The climate front offered no respite from the grim state of security, as carbon emissions began to rise again after a period of plateauing. Added to this is the changing information ecosystem, which has become a threat multiplier. The velocity of information has increased by orders of magnitude, allowing information warfare and fake news to flourish. It generates rage and polarization across the globe at a time when we require calm and unity to solve the globe's biggest problems. We have, in fact, entered a period that we call the new abnormal. This new abnormal that the world now inhabits is unsustainable and unsettling. We appear to be normalizing a very dangerous world in terms of the risks of nuclear warfare and climate change. Before revealing the time, I'd like to ask my colleagues to step up to the podium, please. With Jerry Brown on one side and Secretary Perry on the other. The 2019 time should not be taken as a sign of stability, but as a stark warning. It's a state as worrisome as the most dangerous times of the Cold War. It's a state that features an unpredictable and shifting landscape of simmering disputes that multiply the chances for major conflict to erupt. This new abnormal is simply too volatile and too dangerous to accept as a continuing state of world affairs. Recognizing this grim reality, what we'd like to announce is that it is still 2 minutes to midnight, remaining the closest to midnight that the clock has ever been set. And now I'd like to ask my colleagues to come up to the dais to give you more background on why that is the case. Dr. Perry, we'll start with you for some initial comments.
So 2 minutes to midnight. What does that mean? For me, it invokes memories of 1953. The Soviet Union had just tested a hydrogen bomb. The brutal Korean War was still going on, already having claimed millions of lives. The U.S. forces in Germany were outnumbered 3-1 by the Red Army and fully expected the Red Army to attack them. And they were authorized and prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons to stop that advance. What I'm telling you, you already know from history. But I know it because I was there. So it invokes powerful memories in me. Still, there are differences between now, important differences between now and 1953. There's no Stalin, no Soviet Union, no huge Red Army. So this prospect of a Red Army sweeping against the American forces seems much lower. But the nuclear dangers are not because we expect an attack from Russia or in the old days from the Soviet Union. The danger is that we will blunder. We will blunder into a nuclear war. That was the real danger during the Cold War as well, but certainly the danger now. We think back to the Cold War where we almost did have a hot war. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where political miscalculation could have pushed us into a war. Or we think of the 5 false alarms during the Cold War, any one of which could have propelled us into a nuclear war. On balance, though, the danger today from Russia is much less than the danger from the Soviet Union in 1953. That's on the plus side. On the negative side, though, we now have the danger of a cyber attack, which we didn't fear in 1953. We have the danger of regional nuclear war, North Korea, or India and Pakistan nuclear war. We have the danger of nuclear terrorism. And we have a declining ecological system which is likely to lead us to a climate catastrophe. So on balance, we see this year at least as dangerous as 1953.
Thank you. Dr. Rosner.
Thank you. As chair of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board, I'd like to offer some additional comments before yielding the floor to my colleagues who will discuss the key points that led us to this year's setting of the Doomsday Clock. As you just heard, the Doomsday Clock is being set at 2 minutes to midnight. That is, we have not moved the clock's hands from the position of last year, and the fact that the Doomsday Clock hands did not change is bad news indeed. As you just heard from Bill Perry, it harkens back to the gloomiest days of the Cold War, the early 1950s. As we face today, the potential start of a new international nuclear arms race, and see little effective progress on dealing with ongoing climate change. We are calling this the new abnormal, a disturbing reality in which things are not getting better. We appear to be normalizing a world in which the risks of nuclear warfare and climate change, unchallenged, are ever more present and are not being effectively dealt with. To make matters even worse, our ability to comprehend and act on these huge risks is increasingly degraded by information warfare that clouds the distinctions between fact and fiction, thereby undermining science, political institutions, and the ability to arrive at consensus on the solutions needed to achieve positive change. This is the new abnormal we are now living in.
Thank you. Sharon Squassoni.
Thank you. My task is to speak specifically about nuclear risks. So experts can debate the impact and credibility of specific actions and policies of nuclear-armed states, but the overall trend is clear. Reliance on nuclear weapons for security is up, while reliance on diplomacy, arms control, and non-proliferation is down. Modernization programs, new weapons, new options for using such weapons, and a Cold War mindset threaten decades of work to reduce nuclear risks. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia is an obvious place to start, since those countries hold more than 90% of all nuclear weapons. Russia's flagrant disregard for sovereignty in its near abroad and new intermediate-range ballistic missiles challenge NATO security and increase the risks of escalation. U.S.-Russian arms control is no longer an oasis of dialogue in a desert of competition. There are no new arms control initiatives, and existing agreements are being jettisoned. First, the New START treaty, which could easily be extended, appears destined to die in 2021. Mr. Trump has time to fix this with the stroke of his pen, but will he? Second, Russian violations of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty have precipitated a U.S. withdrawal, which is scheduled for next week. The only agreement ever to ban an entire class of missiles, the INF Treaty, has been a linchpin of Europe's security for 30 years. The United States may use this opportunity to field a new weapon in that range, but for the Asian theater. Third, the U.S., Russia, and China will build new nuclear weapons as part of their modernization efforts, but U.S. plans for expanding missile defense could upset the strategic balance in a big way. China, which has long complained about the destabilizing effect of missile defenses, has stated that U.S. plans, outlined in the recent Missile Defense Review, could, and I quote, damage regional peace and security, influence the process of international nuclear disarmament, lead to an arms race, and undermine the strategic balance and stability in the world. Russian officials equated U.S. development of space-based sensors for missile defense with setting off an arms race in space. Regional security risks are no less worrisome. Mr. Trump made good on his campaign promise to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal in May 2018 and reimpose sanctions in November, while the European Union and other parties to the agreement have been feverishly working to put in place mechanisms that allow them to continue implementing the agreement. It's not clear how successful these will be or how long Iran will be patient. In Asia, North Korea's engagement with South Korea, the U.S., and China has been a decidedly positive development. Mr. Kim has kept his word on halting nuclear and missile tests, but more concrete measures are required to truly reduce nuclear risks, and this could take a decade or two. Against this backdrop of competition, quiet multilateral arms control and nonproliferation treaties and agreements and negotiations, without which a vast array of weapons of mass destruction-related risks could spiral out of control, go largely unattended. It's easy to forget that long-standing arms control goals require leadership and multilateral support. In addition to the agreements I just mentioned that are under the threat of collapse, there are a few more that need support to reduce nuclear risks, like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed 20 years ago, not entered into force, a Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which has been on the negotiation agenda for about 70 years, and a nuclear weapons ban, which was concluded at the UN in 2017. This is controversial, but it was signed by 70 countries so far, and some say that it may not be a practical vehicle for nuclear disarmament, but nuclear weapon states and their allies ignore it at their peril. The ban reflects the frustration of most countries around the world for the slow pace of nuclear disarmament. To sum up, in the new abnormal, arms races seem preferred to arms control and nonproliferation agreements, and unilateral actions threaten the stability, predictability, and transparency that such agreements previously created. If this is indeed an era of great power competition, then it deserves great solutions that walk us back from the brink of nuclear conflict, not towards it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Solomon?
I'll summarize our position on climate change. So this year's news on climate change is deeply alarming in several ways. Global carbon dioxide emissions show how the world is doing at addressing the terrible risks of climate change. And after a few years in which global emissions looked like they were plateauing, we've continued an upward climb in 2017, even faster in 2018. That's very bad news, because if we're going to halt the worst impacts of climate change, the nations of the world have got to cut worldwide emissions to zero well before the end of the century. Every year that emissions continue to climb represents a year in which we not only haven't started on that task, but we've made the challenge of doing it even bigger. Some countries, including the US and some members of the EU, have increased their emissions after years of progress in reducing them. And it's the US that has more resources to develop and implement cleaner energy alternatives than poorer nations have. So our failure to even stop the rise in our own emissions is simply an act of gross negligence. Even worse than that, the increasing emissions mean that we've installed new infrastructure, such as power plants, that will continue to emit carbon dioxide, not just this year, but for the lifetime of the plant, something like 50 years or so. And every year that we continue to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere irreversibly ratchets up the level of human suffering and ecosystem destruction that will occur due to global climate change. On top of all that, the main global accord to address climate change, the 2015 Paris Agreement, has been under increasing attack. The US announced that it will withdraw from that pact, and compounding our national lack of leadership on that, at a UN climate meeting last month, we undercut an expert assessment of climate change for the UN from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We did that for the first time. We chose instead to ally ourselves with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait to snub the report, instead of welcoming the input of science on a key international environmental problem. That the world is losing ground in reducing emissions flies in the face of increasing evidence for how bad this new abnormal actually is. Greenland's ice is melting at an unprecedented rate. 2018 is likely to be the fourth warmest year on record, in spite of the fact that there's been a reduced effect of El Nino compared to the 3 record years that came before it, 2015, 16, and 17. Scientific evidence shows that global warming has contributed to the occurrence of some very serious world catastrophes, including the massive wildfires seen this past year in California, Greece, and Sweden, and the heat waves that have turned deadly for people and animals in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America. Even with all the evidence of our increasingly disrupted climate, denialists continue to avoid action. President Trump spurned the national climate assessment prepared by his own agencies and other scientists with an offhand statement of, "I don't believe it." The new abnormal climate that we already have is extremely dangerous, and we've moved into a path that will make our future much more dangerous still. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lin?
So my 2 previous colleagues have talked about nuclear war and climate change and disruption as important threats. In the last year, we've also come to understand much better an ongoing and intentional corruption of the information environment, which polarizes rather than unites populations, undermines rather than enhances trust in science, and diminishes rather than increases confidence in elections and democratic institutions. What our leaders complain about fake news, by which they mean information they don't like. They invoke alternative facts when reality is inconvenient. They're shamelessly inconsistent. They think anecdotally and remember selectively rather than using reason or scientific evidence. They debase established institutions of government, journalism, education that hold them accountable. Now, these practices attack the very idea of rational discourse and thus aggravate the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and climate disruption and change. Now, it's true that propaganda and lies and so on have been around for a very long time. They go back to biblical days. But in the internet age, the volume and velocity of information is increased by orders of magnitude. So you have social media, you have search engines, you have mobile devices, and so on. All of these contribute to what we call cyber-enabled information warfare. Before it was information warfare. Now it's cyber-enabled information warfare. And it's a lot worse. The easy connectivity and high degrees of anonymity can mean that information warriors can act across national borders. Information warriors can practice their trade now against large populations very inexpensively, and at the same time tailor messages also very inexpensively to narrow interest groups to set one against the other. This isn't cyber war in the sense of nationwide electrical blackouts and the like, although that's still a concern of the Bulletin, but it's a more insidious use of cyber technology, cyber tools to target and exploit weaknesses in human cognition and thinking, and eroding the cohesion that underpins civilized societies. I want you to think about the Enlightenment, where reason is a fundamental pillar is the foundation of civilized discourse. Logical argument in the Enlightenment world matters, and the truth of a statement is tested by an examination of reality, not how many people believe in it. That's how we got flat earths. It's a terrible world in which rage and fantasy replace logic and truth. And cyber-enabled information portends just such a world, and if it's left unchecked, it undermines our ability, the world's ability, to deal constructively with all of the threats facing us, including especially those of nuclear weapons and climate change.
Thank you. Governor?
I speak as someone who has been in the American political process for almost 50 years. And I can say at this moment, the blindness and stupidity of the politicians and their consultants is truly shocking in the face of nuclear catastrophe and danger. We're not expecting a bolt out of the blue, but based on the close calls of the past, we know that these thousands of nuclear weapons on high alert could be launched by mistake or error. That's what's happened in the past, almost. So we're almost like travelers on the Titanic, not seeing the iceberg up ahead, but enjoying the elegant dining and the music. The business of everyday politics blinds people to the risk. We're playing Russian roulette with humanity, and the danger and the probability is mounting that there will be some kind of nuclear incident that will kill millions, if not initiating exchanges that will kill billions. Given that threat, why aren't people more concerned? Because they're not. People feel very comfortable in high places at living at the brink of total Armageddon and catastrophe. I've seen it. I was over in the Capitol. Yes, there are some leaders that are concerned, but we need Republicans and Democrats, the president, members of his staff, to fully grasp the moment that is upon us. They're not grasping that. It is 2 minutes to midnight. And journalists, yes, you love Trump's tweets. You love the news of the day. You love the leads that get the clicks. But the final click could be a nuclear accident or mistake. And that's what we have to all be worried about, and that's why we gather around this unveiling of the Doomsday Clock. It's hard to even feel or sense the peril and danger that we're in. But these scientists know what they're talking about. And I can say, based on my understanding of the political process, the politicians, for the most part, do not. So yeah, it's late and it's getting later, and we've got to wake people up. Wake people up in Washington, throughout the country, and throughout the world. And that's what I intend to do, and I will spend the next few years doing everything I can to sound the alarm and get us back on a track of dialogue, collaboration, and arms control.
Thank you. We are now open to questions. Please wait for me to recognize you, and then wait for the mic to come to you, and then give your affiliation so we know who you're talking to. Right here in the middle, right there.
Hi, Voice of America. To Secretary Perry, I'd like to ask you about North Korea. So North Korea, they stopped missile testing in 2018, but that doesn't mean that North Korea stopped their nuclear developments. So I'd like to ask you about your assessment on North Korea's nuclear weapons and your prospects for the second U.S.-North Korea summit. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think North Korea has a nuclear arsenal of 20 or 30 nuclear weapons. Many medium-range missiles deliver those, and a few long-range missiles you could deliver them. So it's something to be concerned about. I think they have no plans or intention to use those nuclear weapons in an unprovoked way. The danger is that we, again, with North Korea, as with Russia, is that we'll blunder into some sort of a nuclear war with them. The last summit meeting, I thought, had little or no substance and did nothing to really move North Korea towards moving towards non-nuclear. On the other hand, and there's a big other hand, it stopped the insults and threats between our two countries, between our two leaders, and therefore reduced the chances of blundering into a war with North Korea. So I think it was good. So by the same token, I'm looking forward to the second summit meeting. I do not expect this summit meeting or any other diplomacy we have underway to cause North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. They've gotten these nuclear weapons at a great cost and a great hardship. They got them because they want to protect their security. They truly believe that the United States would otherwise make a move to overthrow their regime. So they're going to hang on to these nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean we can't find a modus operandi, a way of dealing with them effectively. And the main objective at this time, I think, of the summit meeting is to keep the temperatures down and reduce the likelihood of either side blundering into some kind of a conflict.
Thank you. Yes, right here. Just wait for the mic. Coming right behind you. And introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Sam Husseini,
And for what-
with The Nation and Consortium News. I'd like to raise two things that I don't believe have come up explicitly, and I'd like you to address them. One, explicitly, is Russiagate. Several people, including fellow Nation writer Stephen Cohen, a Russia expert, have warned that the focusing and the charges and the demonization of Putin have reached such a level that they cause a threat, that they increase the instability and the dangers between the U.S. and Russia. If someone could make an assessment about the dangers of that. I'm not talking about Trump's tweets, I'm talking about the Democratic Party establishment and allied media. And the other thing that I don't believe has come up, there's been some discussion about Iran, is Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. Israel just targeted Iranian forces inside Syria. We have Turkey, a NATO member bound by Article 5, involved in Syria as well. It is my understanding the US government has refused to even acknowledge the existence of Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal, which was, of course, exposed years ago by Mordechai Vanunu. Do you recommend a change in that, and can you address how that long-standing abnormal can can be addressed?
Thank you. I'm going to turn the Israel question over to Sharon, but first, I know for Dr. Perry or Governor Brown, if you'd like to answer the first part of the question, I'm happy to take it too, which is the demonization both of Vladimir Putin and the focus on Trump and the interaction between the two. How should we be thinking about the demonization of leaders, particularly those two, at a time when we need to be when these issues are so stark?
I defer to Governor Brown on that.
He defers to you, I think.
Yeah, I think it's stupid for Democrats to be attacking Putin on all issues and not holding open the channel of nuclear dialogue. Yes, deal with the issues in Syria and killing diplomats and Ukraine and Crimea and all the rest of that. But that doesn't warrant a nuclear blunder that kills billions of people or millions. So yes, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or somewhere in between, we need to have dialogue. And something that might help is a bit of humility. Yes, the Russians have plenty of faults and sins, I might even say, but we too have to look in the mirror and see ourselves, and we're not perfect. So in an imperfect world with imperfect human beings, the only path forward is dialogue. Dialogue about the most important threat facing humanity. So yes, knock it off, guys and ladies. Let's talk to Putin. Let's talk to anybody else who can do the kind of damage that you're hearing about from this panel of nuclear scientists.
Thank you, Sharon.
I would just add, one of the disturbing things about not having arms control channels open is that in past instances of crisis, there was always a person-to-person connection. You know, you could pick up a phone because you knew someone and trusted someone. And so that, to me, is a disturbing development. We no longer have those kinds of interactions, and I think we need to reestablish them. On the question of Israel, I left the government about 10 years ago, but yes, you are correct. It was always a kind of Alice in Wonderland experience trying to talk about Israel's nuclear weapons. Now that I'm out of the government, I can say, yes, they do have nuclear weapons. That is a hard question bureaucratically, the way things are arranged, but I agree that this administration is not going to tackle that. Perhaps it will wait until the next one. But ultimately, if we are looking for a fair and non-discriminatory multilateral system that reduces risks, it completely has to take into account Israel.
Thank you. Right here, please. Just wait for the mic and identify yourself, please.
Hi, Miranda Green with The Hill. I want to shift the conversation to climate change a bit. Governor Brown, we're in Washington, D.C. The conversation is already shifting to 2020. Considering the number of studies warning of the effects of climate change, I wanted to ask you, how important is it that the Democratic presidential hopefuls going forward embrace climate change as part of their party platforms and their individual platforms in their races?
Well, the presidential candidates have a lot of shiny new issues or shiny old issues, but climate change is not yet at the top, nor is the nuclear danger that we're discussing today. So, yeah, anybody who wants to run for president better deal with climate change, because it is a huge problem reaching an irreversible state, whether in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, we don't know. But we're headed in the wrong direction, both in our hostility to other nations regarding the nuclear danger and also climate change. So yes, we need the Republicans to wake up, we need Trump to come to the table, and we need Democratic candidates to persuasively and eloquently present good ideas to the American people.
Susan, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Well, only to say that 2020 is really important, because if we don't start reducing emissions in this next decade, it's pretty clear that we will have a world that we wouldn't want to live in, one in which global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees and probably 2 degrees. So this coming decade is absolutely critical, and we're running out of time. 4 years is too long to wait.
Thank you, right here. Just, can you wait just for the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Virginia Heffernan at Wired. This question is for Robert Rossner or Rachel Bronson. A question about how the clock is set. I just, while it's an incredibly graphic data visualization, I don't understand the scale. So 2 minutes to midnight clearly doesn't mean 2 minutes, or we'd be finished right now. But is a minute 50 years? And are we even talking about time when we talk about proximity? Anyway, help me out.
Thank you. Do you want me to take that, or do you want to take that?
Once you start.
Okay, I'll start. So thank you. So in my opening remarks, what I laid out for you is the two questions that we're answering, which is how close is civilization safer or at greater risk today compared to last year and compared to the 70 years at which we are looking at it. And therefore, the time represents our answer to that question. So it is not, it represents a judgment of experts about how we're doing. And so there's not a time period that it represents in terms of years or et cetera. So with each time change, we're trying to convey a message. And with this time change, the message we're conveying is it is as dangerous as it has been since we've been looking at it, including the dark days of the Cold War, as dangerous as 1953, which was very dangerous. And so that's what we're conveying with the time, a judgment by experts who look in their areas very deeply, coming together and answering that question simply. Because what you know, as we ask of experts, is after you look at all of it, what do you think? And this is the most stark yes or no, how are we doing way that we can answer it. Thank you.
And maybe I can just add that I think of the clock as a kind of a metaphor. We understand, even as children, that midnight was a crucial time. Cinderella story is all about that. And I think of it as a kind of a metaphor to keep in mind something throughout the year, that where we are is very close to disaster. So that you should think of it that way. It's not, we're not thinking of it in an entirely quantitative way, the way that you might interpret, but it really is a metaphor.
And Virginia, let me just also add to that, and what we hope comes of the setting of the clock as well. Because it's such a simple statement that it is still 2 minutes to midnight, it is our hope that it generates a conversation across the globe, and we see that it does do that, about why did we do it? Why did we set it at 2? Do you agree that it should be set at 2 minutes to midnight? And if not, why? Closer or further away? These issues that we're tackling are so complex, and people find it very difficult to enter into that conversation, certainly over the dinner table. If this provides an opportunity to talk about nuclear risk, climate change, disruptive technologies, and it provides an entry ramp into that conversation, then the clock continues to do its job.
Maybe we can.
I want to just, the lead on this is often no change, no, so that's okay. And that's not okay. That's the point of saying it's the new abnormal, right? The fact that there's no change is bad. And that's the message that we're all trying to convey in here.
Yeah, maybe one last comment about this issue is that I want to tie something that Sharon said to this as well. If you think about the early 1950s, 53 in particular, at that time, there were many attempts to do back-channel conversations. There were American physicists, American political scientists who were heavily involved in conversations with their Soviet counterparts. And it was part of the trust building behind the scenes that took literally years until we finally were able to have substantive conversations about a non-proliferation treaty. Those conversations, as Sharon pointed out, don't go on today. And that is really scary to think about. We're not building trust with our adversaries.
Great. Bill Press, please.
Yes, Bill Press with columnist for The Hill. I wanted to ask Governor Brown and Secretary Perry, you mentioned, Governor, you met with some members of Congress yesterday. If you had, assuming you could get the votes, what could Congress do today? What would you want to see Congress do today to meet this threat?
Congress could, first of all, ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Congress could restrict the sole power of the president to press the button and blow up the world, and Congress could pass a bill setting no first use of nuclear weapons as our policy. And finally, the Congress, both Democrat and Republican, could start meeting with members of the Duma, could encourage generals and other important personages in America to meet with the Russians. Right now, there's almost zero dialogue in the face of rising danger. So the Congress has to do its part as a co-equal branch, along with the executive. And as far as I'm concerned, it's massive sleepwalking all over the place.
I can't improve on that answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time. We want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll all continue this conversation. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.